Let's get started with our second and final keynote of the day, and we are really thrilled to be joined by both Gurbir Grewal and Bill McLucas. Gurbir is our keynote today. He's a partner now at Milbank in the firm's New York office. Before joining Milbank, he served for over 3 years as director of the SEC's Division of Enforcement and also as Attorney General of the state of New Jersey. As enforcement director, he was our keynote multiple times. This is the first no disclaimer keynote.
No disclaimers, yeah. Look for the new podcast, no disclaimers, yeah.
Gurbir, thanks so much. And of course, our moderator is Bill McLucas. He's a partner at WilmerHale based in Washington, D.C. Bill joined WilmerHale after serving for more than 8 years as director of the enforcement division, the most years of any enforcement director ever. Bill, thank you so much for moderating. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. So before I agreed to do this, I got together with Gurbir and we talked about what we might do on a panel like this. And you know, when you're going to interview the director of enforcement, you want to be polite and politic, and we went over the questions and the topics we might cover, and then it occurred to me, he's not the director anymore. And I don't have to be politic, I don't even have to be nice. So last evening, I had dinner with a number of folks from Stone Turn and a number of lawyers and accountants, and I said to people, look, what do you guys think I ought to ask Gurbir tomorrow? And folks wrote out a number of questions. I haven't screened them, and I thought, you know, let's get a candid set of questions about what people really want to know the answer to. So here's the first one. It says, Gurbir, during your tenure, penalties went through the roof, especially in the off-channel communication and texting area. What the hell were you thinking? You don't have to answer it.
Happy to answer it, but
we'll get to that. So you've only been gone a few months now, Gurbir, and as you reflect on your time as the director, let me ask you, what do you think worked well while you were there? As you look back, what aspects of the program do you think really were effective and resulted in a good job for the agency?
Yeah, thanks for the question, and you know, thanks for agreeing to do this at the last minute. For all those of you who signed up for this conference thinking this would be a conversation with Sanjay Wadhwa, I'm sorry that he's not here. For all those of you who've thought all these years that I was in fact Sanjay Wadhwa, I'm also sorry. But it happened quite a few times in some Wells meetings when people would call me Sanjay, and I never held it against anybody. You know, I guess we're both tall. So listen, I think I have had 160 or so days to be reflective since I've left the commission. And, you know, I think what worked well, you know, what I'm most proud of is this, Nader George. And let me explain what I mean by that. When I got to the commission in 21, that fall, we served a subpoena on Do Kwon, and we served that subpoena at a crypto conference. And the whole world came out against us. Whether it was on Twitter, whether it was in the press, whether it was, you know, in the mainstream news, people were saying, how could you do this at a conference? How could you do this? You know, he's not even within your jurisdiction. But the staff persevered and they kept pushing through. And you flash forward into early 22, Bill, you have the collapse of Terraform, right? $45 billion in market capitalization wiped out in an instant. You have the crypto winter. You have eventually charges against Do Kwon by us, by criminal authorities. And you flash forward, you have a trial in early 24. And at that trial, the staff called as a witness Nader George. Nader George was a pharmacist from California who had $400,000 in savings, who took that $400,000 after watching YouTube videos and other materials touting the safety of the Terraform stablecoin and the Anchor protocol, who put all that money and more into that protocol. And he did so right before everything collapsed, and he lost everything. And the staff told his story. And then the staff persevered through that case and got a favorable verdict. And the staff persevered through the sentencing phase, the penalties, and got a $4.5 billion penalty against Terraform, the largest, I think, in the securities fraud case in history. That brought some measure of closure for Nader George. And so that's what I'm most proud of. That's what I think worked well. That's what, despite how the political winds may shift, despite how things may be popular and some positions we take may be unpopular, the staff consistently pushed through and didn't tweet back because we couldn't tweet back, didn't speak out, but just did the work to tell the story of victims and protected investors, no matter the criticism, no matter the headwinds. And that's just one example of the headwinds we pushed through during the last 3.5 to 4 years. And that's what I'm proud of. That's what I think worked well, like the commitment of the staff, and that's what will carry this commission and that agency through whatever comes ahead, that staff that's just so dedicated to protecting investors.
Well, there's been, speaking of crypto, as you know, a lot of criticism and pushback, and the climate is certainly going to change. And one of the things I think that affected the view of the agency's effectiveness with respect to crypto was the register on the one hand, and how do I register? It's up to you. And I think, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. That certainly is going to change what the vehicle will be, what the regulatory approach will be, but it's something that frustrated a lot of the firms, a lot of defense counsel, and certainly more recently frustrated one court to the point that it commented directly on that. What if anything, your enforcement though, you're not in charge of the regulatory agenda of the agency, but and looking back, if you can, would you comment on whether you think it may have been wiser and made the program more effective had we balanced the two approaches more effectively, I guess, for lack of a better word?
Yeah, I mean, with hindsight, sure. I think we should have probably done more to create off-ramps to registration, but I think when you're in the moment and you're blocking and tackling and you're taking investor complaints like the investor complaints from Nader George and so many other Nader Georges, when you have the collapse of Terraform and FTX and the crypto winter and you've got case after case of grift and fraud, you're trying to, as an enforcement attorney, deal with all of that. But when you're standing up in front of courts on registration cases and the court's looking at you after the people on the other side say that they're ready to register, and you as an enforcement attorney don't have a place to point them or a way for them to come in and do that, it makes your job very difficult. So sure, in hindsight, if there was more that we could have done to bring people in to find those pathways to registration, I think we did a lot. I think more maybe could have been done. But I think you also have to remember that at least some folks, the whole ethos of the space was to be outside the regulatory perimeter. And so you're also battling with that. For something that started out to disintermediate finance, you had an awful lot of intermediaries, right? And so who are making money off of transactions and trades. And so there was a lot to balance. Sure, with the benefit of hindsight, maybe more could have been done or should have been done, and I understand the frustrations of many. But I think that the enforcement folks, with their sort of focus on the immediate investor harm, did everything that they could in that moment to protect investors. And they'll do it with whatever next issue presents moving forward.
So we began with what you think worked well in the program. If you have any thoughts on what didn't work so well, or what, as you look back now, you say, look, could have done this, maybe should have done that, maybe tinkered here, tinkered there.
Yeah.
Anything in specific that you would revisit?
A couple of things. I wish there was a way that we could have done more to protect the staff, because I was a state attorney general and I was a county prosecutor, and I was used to getting threats, and I was used to getting attacked, and I was used to getting people putting my personal information out there and people showing up at my home. I think our staff were put in a position, in an environment where they were attacked in a way like I've never seen before. And there wasn't much we could do to console them, right? I would put my name on every pleading if that helped, but people will figure out who showed up in these different court hearings. So I think that's one thing. I wish we did better. On the other side of the ledger, on the cases we brought, I mean, you mentioned off-channel at the beginning of this. As a state attorney general, as a prosecutor, I really saw the value in sweeps and initiatives. The one piece of advice that I would give to whoever takes the chair, whether it's Sam in the long term or whoever comes in after Sam, is sweeps and initiatives are effective in getting people to focus on risk areas and change behaviors. But when you're thinking about a sweep or an initiative, the same time you're ramping up, you need to be figuring out what the ramp down is going to be, what the exit strategy is going to be, because if you don't, then it presents a lot of issues when you're trying to figure out, well, where do you stop it? And how do you draw that line in fairness to the first person who comes in to address an issue, and then maybe somebody in that same first batch of the sweep drag their feet, and just because they drag their feet till 2 years later, should they benefit that you've already made the point here? How is that fair to the entities that came in and resolved things more quickly? So I think looking back, a clearer exit strategy would have been a wise thing. But again, in the moment, we were dealing with a situation where we were encountering these circumstances in a lot of cases where you put in a request and people didn't have the documents you requested, but counterparties did. And through that process, you saw that people were not keeping the records that they were required to keep. And so that was a problem that was systemic that we were trying to address, that I think we did address, but a clearer exit strategy would have helped.
So most of the discussions earlier today, we're all crystal ball gazing. We don't know where this agency is going to go, the program priorities. We certainly, I would expect that the disclosure initiatives around carbon footprint, the initiatives generally around DEI, which I believe include some of the enforcement cases, are going to likely be either off the radar screen entirely or close to it. What, if anything, do you think or see, if you can, as the program priority areas? And it's really a hard question because we don't know who the new director will be, and we don't know how the enforcement priorities are going to be set. To some degree, they're going to be set by the marketplace. Mm-hmm. I mean, if I could digress for 1 minute. In 1980, when President Reagan was elected, it was the greatest deregulatory movement since the New Deal. The transition report recommended that the Division of Enforcement be chopped up, 50 people held in Washington, everybody else sent to the regions. That part wasn't adopted, but the budget was cut, staff levels were cut, morale was, I'd say, not good. It was okay, people marched in step, did their jobs, but by 1984, we were in the middle of the M&A boom, the insider trading scandals, Dennis Levine, Ivan Boesky, Marty Siegel, the Deputy Secretary of Defense charged with insider trading. Insider Trading Sanctions Act passed in 84. Penny Stock Fraud Act passed in 87. The Remedies Act with penalties passed in 90. All during 12 years of Republican administration. By the end of the decade, the budget was doubled. The staff grew enormously. All of which is to say, this transition is different. The view of government is different. But we don't know what is on the horizon. And to some extent, I'm sure when you walked into the job, you had no idea crypto would be a thing, much less the thing. And do you have any sense of what might be on the horizon facing the new director and the new commission?
Yeah, just one last point on the crypto point. Certainly it was on the radar. I don't think we anticipated it would be on the radar in the way that it was. But even then, a lot of people look back and have criticism of like this hypothetical expense that we did these cases at the expense of those cases, and that wasn't the case. Like, we covered the entire waterfront, and we didn't give up looking at something because we were focused on risk and harm here. But divining what's going to happen or where things are going to go from two commissioner statements and history of dissents and looking at statements by Commissioner Atkins, it's hard, it's difficult to figure out, but I think there are obvious areas. Like on crypto, certainly the first announcement was on the crypto fraud task force or the crypto task force to do this sort of thinking around the issue. You're not going to see the intermediaries cases. It'll be an interesting law school hypothetical question, like as to when they could unwind those cases, because it's going to require a vote to deauthorize them, because you have 3 commissioners, and I don't know if one doesn't show up. Is that a quorum, or do you not have a quorum, or is it because of the reason that one commissioner doesn't show up? And so maybe those.
This is real, by the way. Yeah. The point he's making about is there going to be a quorum if a commissioner with 3 on the commission decides not to show up? I think you're out of business.
I think it depends on the reason they don't show up, and so it's a little nuanced. But I say that as a way of just sort of sharing. I don't know if those sort of big moves, if they're going to happen, are going to happen right away as people are thinking or hoping that they will happen. There will be a move from those cases against the intermediaries to the pure fraud cases, for sure. Everyone is signaling that. What'll be interesting is how they assert jurisdiction over those fraud cases. I suspect it'll be making the same arguments that we made over the last 3.5 years that drew a lot of criticism. If you're going to bring those cases even, penalties are going to be, I think it's safe to say they'll be less than before, and certainly in issuer cases, unless you can show a clear corporate benefit tied to the misconduct. That'll be an obvious shift. We were talking about sweeps and initiatives and the off-channel communications cases. I don't suspect that you'll see much of that. You'll see much more done through the examinations process and through guidance from the policy divisions. And then, I think there was a super interesting speech yesterday that Commissioner Peirce gave out in San Diego. And I don't know if she's the first one who's coined this, but there's always this criticism of regulation by enforcement, but she was talking about management by enforcement, that through enforcement tools, you're forcing issuers and asset managers to make certain management decisions, whether it's around ESG, whether it's around their cybersecurity practices, that you're using disclosure controls and procedures, and you're using internal accounting controls as these levers to do that. And so I think it's safe to say, given the dissents around those types of cases, whether it's SolarWinds, some of the ESG cases, that, as you were framing earlier, you're not likely to see much more of that. On the ESG front, the task force was unwound during our time there, and it wasn't unwound because no one cared about ESG. It was unwound because these are disclosure cases at the end of the day, and where they result in a breach of a fiduciary duty, we bring those cases. Where they are fraudulent when it comes to an issuer on a sustainability report, we bring those cases and have brought those cases and will continue to bring those cases. And if you look at the votes on those cases, I don't think they were 3-2. So, those clear-cut cases, those will continue. But around the edges, when you're pushing, according to some of the commissioners, the edges of a tool or a rule to bring a case like that, whether it's in the cybersecurity space or the ESG space, you'll certainly see less of that. And the one thing, and I'll finish here, and then you could ask the other questions you got over drinks last night. The one thing I'm really interested in seeing is whether you'll see these anti-ESG cases, right? Whether you'll see cases brought under a breach of fiduciary duty type theory against asset managers who are pursuing an ESG agenda, much like the Republican letter from 10 Republican AGs on Friday to asset managers and banks, making these sort of allegations. This is on the heels of the American Airlines ERISA case in Texas. So that'll be super interesting. And then, having been a state AG during Trump 1, I suspect then you'll see the other side of it. You'll see the Democratic AGs line up and say, oh no, it's a breach of your fiduciary duty if you're going to shift because this is important to investors and you're abandoning your fiduciary duty to your investors. So, it's a vicious cycle that a lot of folks are trapped in who are in the asset management space and in the banking space to try to navigate competing factions of state AGs and then trying to figure out what the SEC is going to do. So it's a pretty, there's a lot of minefields out there, I think, around these types of issues.
Just a great country. Let me ask you a question on process. We've all adjusted to COVID, work at home. Now we're in a very, very different time period. And my perspective is that the work at home issue, particularly at the SEC, is now sort of ingrained. And I know it's part of what I think the union expects. I think it's actually hurt the agency, hurt the culture. And what do you see as the pressure and likelihood of success of getting people back into the office, in the environment? I thought there was nothing better when I was a kid lawyer than being able to go down the hall and sit down and hear somebody else walk through an analysis or a problem, or some of what you hear is not so great, some of what you hear is great, but you learn. Yeah. And I think it's something we've lost in private practice, and I fear we've lost a little bit of it at the SEC. Do you think there's going to be, we know there's going to be pressure, but is the agency going to get back to more of a normal back in the office routine?
The pressure is already there through the executive orders. I don't know if it happens or not, and how that interfaces with the labor agreements. But I agree with you. I think the law is an apprenticeship type profession where you learn sort of, from others who practice around you. I certainly learned a lot as a young lawyer, walking into rooms and just being present in meetings and seeing how people either interviewed witnesses or how they prepared for examinations or how they prepared for arguments. And you could replicate a lot of that online, but you can't replicate all of it. And certainly the spontaneity of it, where, I get a call even, this week on an issue, which was somewhat novel for me. I could just walk down the hall to one of my colleagues and say, hey, I just got this call. And so that type of collaboration and learning is super hard to replicate. And I think, it delays people's development as lawyers, but one thing I will say is that the folks at the commission, especially the senior officers, despite the constraints, we're always looking for creative ways to bring people back in the office, to train them, to have these types of conversations within the framework of the collective bargaining agreements. So the home office in DC, I know Melissa and Carolyn were here. They had a terrific program to try to replicate that sort of training. And so, it requires more, and it's not as organic as it was when, you're just in the office.
So a couple of other process questions, Gurbir, because, there's been talk now about maybe putting time limits on investigations. When I was in the government, I heard that, I rolled my eyes. Now that I'm out here, I do a little bit of both. I think good thing, bad thing. But there's an impression among a significant constituency of the bar that people won't make hard decisions and close cases or move on. And part of that I trace back to the Madoff situation and the beating that the commission staff took on the Hill. But the idea of closing the case off or saying, we're done here, we're going to go on to something else, balanced against the fear that, my God, what if we miss something? Seems to now have the judgment has been rendered in favor of hold on to it, we don't want to miss something. And it goes on and on and on. And then you can't get an answer from the staff. If you call the staff to talk about it, 6 people get on the phone call to call you back and they tell you nothing, that we can't tell you anything. So what do you think can be done to incentivize people, make the decisions? And you're going to make mistakes.
Yeah.
Sometimes you're going to throw one back and think it doesn't meet the 6-inch test and it's going to be 12 inches. But that's what you're paid to do.
Yeah, you can't put timelines on investigations because you don't know what you're investigating until you get into it. And so, the most basic complaint can turn into the most complex fraud that's going to require, a multi-year investigation in some cases. And, you get an enterprising defense attorney or counsel on the other side who drags things out knowing you have a clock against you. Like it just, it just doesn't work. I think, listen, the answer or the fault lies at people like me, not at the staff. And, there are those cases where, sometimes you see them when they come across your desk and you're wondering, this was opened when? And it took this long to do this, why? And so I think it's incumbent on whoever takes the role next, it's incumbent on the supervisors to be plugged in to their cases and to supervise them actively and to have an understanding if things aren't moving, why they aren't moving. One of the techniques I used when I was a supervisor at the U.S. Attorney's Office was I had, weekly meetings and we had the agenda, and if something showed up on the weekly meeting, 2 or 3 weeks in a row and it wasn't moving, I think folks felt a sense of pressure or shame, like I really need to, I can't show up to the next meeting with this still on my list and in the same posture. So it requires active supervision. It requires people like me or whoever takes the role next messaging that we have your back, right? These are tough decisions. But ultimately, if you've done the work and if you've exercised your judgment and you've looked at something, it's okay. Not every investigation needs to result in an enforcement recommendation for that to be a good investigation. I've said that before. I don't think this is a numbers game that your success should be measured by the number of enforcement recommendations. You should credit those investigations and recognize them that you closed because they were a good investigation, because you don't know when something's coming across your desk where it's going to lead. So I think it's incumbent on leadership to do more to let people know they have that support to close things.
So let me ask you another process question, which is somewhat caught up with this whole revolving door criticism that you've heard a lot over the last, I guess, decade or two. But if a well-respected member of the defense bar calls you on a case and says, Gurbir, I've got this case that involves X, Y, and Z. Your folks are just out in left field. It's crazy. It should be closed. And I'd like to have a meeting with you. There is a rule that says you can't really say much to them about that in that call, and that if you're going to meet with them, you have to have lined up the entire staff. And tell me, in your view, how effective that is, or whether indeed it actually inhibits your ability to get a window on some matters that maybe you should take a look at.
Yeah, I mean, it's in the enforcement manual, so it's guidance. Listen, I think it's really the perception, right? And you don't want there to be this perception that certain folks have access, and because of their access, their cases are handled differently. So that's an important thing to be conscious of. At a personal level, and this dates back to when I was a local prosecutor, and certainly dates back to when I was Attorney General, thankfully, I never met with anybody alone. And I'm thankful for that, because there have been situations, including a situation where I had to testify, where I'm glad my first Assistant Attorney General was in the meeting with me, because then there's no ambiguity as to who said what to whom. There's two people who were there, and no matter how you try to twist it or say that something happened, these two people are going to have a record of it, a recollection of it. And so I think it's important for the perception. It's important to deflect against those sort of allegations that something untoward happened. Having said that, I think, and this is in the category of mistakes that were made, I broke my own rule when we messaged out at an early time that we were going to shorten the Wells process or not have a Wells meeting in every case. When I was AG and when I was a county prosecutor, I always told myself, don't make any rash decision in the first 6 months. And why I say that is because you learn so much in that process. And the intent was never to say we don't believe in this process. It was just to say, not every case will deserve one of these meetings, because there are some cases where it's just, there's no issue. There's no legal issue, factual issue, or other issue. In the cases where there are real issues, the cases where we walked away from those recommendations, that process results in better decision making. We don't get it right all the time, but we try to get it right. And so I think that was perceived in the wrong way, and I tried to clean it up for months and years afterwards. And we took a heck of a lot of meetings. And so I think there's a value to that interaction. Bill and I would meet periodically for coffee, but I'm like, hey, I know we're not going to talk about cases, but let's just meet far away from the office, right? Because I don't want somebody to think Bill is talking to me about anything other than, just how you doing? Like, this is a tough job, stay the course, everything's going to be fine. Like, you need that, and you also need the mentorship and the experience on just how to run an organization. So I met with all the enforcement directors before I started in the role. And Bill was one who I would just sort of, every 6 to 8 months, no agenda, just have a cup of coffee, just to check in.
And I wouldn't buy a latte, it was coffee. And the other thing, we're getting near the end here, but you find when you're in that job, though, that when people would call you for a meeting, there are some lawyers who call you because they're annoyed, or they don't like the staff lawyer, or it's a rainy day. You learn that really quickly. And they have so depreciated their credibility. And then there are some lawyers that you know, when I was a director, if I got a call from a guy like Larry Pedowitz, who was at Wachtell Lipton, that was, you know, once in a blue moon. And when Pedowitz said, I think you ought to take a look at this case, I looked at the case.
Yeah.
And it goes to the credibility of the process and, frankly, the credibility of the director because, you know, fortunately, this agency has been one where nobody at that level has ever been that either naive or much less susceptible to being unduly influenced. And that's basically a credit to the agency and to the directors that I think the chairs have been wise enough to put in place. We have about a half a minute. Any parting thoughts, Gurbir, to whomever might succeed you as to what you would say do or don't do?
Don't make any rash decisions in the first 6 months.
See, I had just the opposite. I figured get them all out in the first 6 months. What the hell?
And respect and protect the staff because they're sort of the engine that keep that place going. They're the people, no matter what the headwinds are, who are going to stand up for investors. And you know, I think particularly in this moment, they deserve to know that whoever's going to come in that role is going to have their backs if they do their jobs the right way and insulate them from the politics that are all around them right now.
And the transition will be particularly challenging psychologically for the line staff people. Everyone has to recognize that they're spending an inordinate amount of their time wondering, where will I be tomorrow? What will my agenda be? Who will the supervisor be? And it's tough because you want to keep doing your job and keep moving. On the other hand, there are at least a handful of cases that I'm aware of where the aggressiveness, it's like a hurry up to shoot the defendant before the jury comes in on this, but hopefully we won't get there until we know the direction of the agency and the philosophy that's going to govern the enforcement agenda and the chairman's views, and all of that is going to change. I think the one thing that won't change is, even in the short term, if people think that it's going to be the Audubon, there will be many accidents if that's the case, and there will be a need for pretty aggressive enforcement. The question just simply is when and in what area.
When and what area and who. And I go back to state AGs, state securities regulators. Somebody's going to be looking at something if something went sideways. And so it shouldn't be an invitation to violate the securities laws or test the edges of the rules.
Well, we have a couple minutes. Anybody have any questions? Anything anybody wants to ask? Not me, Gurbir.
And we're out of time. All right. Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Bruce.